I simply have to review this movie. It's a moral imperative. Hi, I'm Mike Siegel. I'm an astrophysicist. I write for Ordinary Times, and this is The Throughput. So I hadn't actually planned on doing today's movie, but I was having a discussion about it with somebody, and I realized I really should talk about this, even though it's a little bit out of my bailiwick. A lot of the characters and situations and the scenarios are similar to what occur in science, and there's a lot of interesting commentary. And it's one of my personal favorite movies, and since it's my channel, I guess I can talk about the movies I like. So the movie I'm talking about is, of course, 1985's Real Genius. The story concerns Mitch Taylor, who is recruited as a high school student to attend a thinly disguised Caltech called Pacific Tech, where he works in a lab with genius Chris Knight to develop a laser that is secretly for a military project, although they don't know it. Hijinks ensue, there's lots of running around, people crack jokes, you know the routine. This kind of disappeared in the waves in 1985 because the 1980s were kind of the peak of the teen comedy movie. And in 1985 alone, you had Back to the Future, of course, which was a huge hit. You had Teen Wolf, you had The Breakfast Club, you had Weird Science, you had the Care Bears movie, whatever. You had a whole bunch of these teen movies. And Real Genius made $12 million in the box office, was 65th at the box office that year, and sort of disappeared. It does have a little bit of a cult following, though. Anytime I mention it on Twitter or anywhere else, I do get a bunch of people who say, yeah, I love that movie. That's great. And so I thought I'd give a little talk about it. Now, this is going to be a little bit of an adventure for me because the plot of the movie concerns itself with lasers, and I am not an expert on lasers. Like most astronomers, I am very happy to use lasers, but I have very little idea of how they work. But I know the basics. I have been doing a little bit of background research while preparing for this, so I understand some of the concepts they are talking about, and we'll try to muddle through as best we can. But I'm going to talk more about the feel of the movie and how it really gets what it's like to be around a bunch of smart people and so forth. So we'll just dive right in and have some fun.
Scanner on. Target locked. Tracking locked. Roger. It does it. That's it. Hold it right there.
Crossbow Project. There's no defect.
All right, so this Crossbow Project basically lays out what is trying to be developed. A laser that would be able to operate from a spaceship and shoot a target on the surface of the Earth. This weapon system is, even at the time, very impractical. To shoot a target on the surface of the Earth, remember, if you're, say, in low Earth orbit, you're moving around the Earth at thousands of miles an hour. So it's very hard to track a target on the surface of the Earth. Now, they do talk about a tracking system later that would try to solve that, but it's still, you'd have to be constantly adjusting your aim to get at. You're also shooting through the atmosphere, which is going to absorb some of the light. And even if you were able to hit the target, you have to have a sort of sustained beam that would be able to inject that much energy. You know, we use lasers on people's skin when we do laser surgery, and it takes a while to burn through. And so you'd have to have something extraordinarily powerful here. There was in the 1980s a thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, which was a series of programs that were designed to try to intercept nuclear missiles if they were ever launched from the Soviet Union at the United States. And one of the things that they considered in this was the X-ray laser. That is a platform that would have a very powerful X-ray laser. The higher you go in energy from optical to ultraviolet to X-rays, the more energy the laser is delivering in any single punch. And so this X-ray laser would be able to deliver onto a nuclear missile or even a bunch of nuclear missiles this enormous amount of energy to destroy them. This turned out not to be very practical. You would need an enormous amount of power. Probably you would have to have it powered by a nuclear weapon, which would have violated various treaties. And you have to, the missile is moving at 6 kilometers a second anyway, so you have to be able to sustain that beam on it and able to destroy it. This movie was kind of prophetic in that there was eventually a scandal in the Strategic Defense Initiative's X-ray program. Project Excalibur was going to use X-ray lasers to destroy incoming nuclear missiles, and it turned out they'd been overstating their results and concealing some of the limitations, and the program was eventually canceled because they'd been essentially lying about what it was capable of. So eventually the X-ray lasers and so forth were ditched in favor of anti-ballistic missiles and other defense systems that were more practical. And that's a really good illustration. We abandoned the X-ray laser because other methods were better. That's why you wouldn't use a laser like this to assassinate someone. It's really much easier to actually assassinate someone with laser-guided missiles or bombs these days we would be able to use. And even then with a sniper or something like that, a lot of the times with these very sophisticated weapon systems, it turns out that using a more traditional weapon system is cheaper and easier and more reliable. And so this idea of a space plane, especially one so small, being able to generate this enormous amount of energy to be able to vaporize a human being in just a second is kind of ridiculous. But Martha Coolidge, the director of Real Genius, said this was on purpose. When they started writing this movie, they didn't want to give anyone ideas for the kind of weapon systems they could use. So they thought of something that was actually impractical and probably wouldn't work. And in this case, they hit it. So an inaccuracy that you could develop this weapon system, but an accuracy in terms of that's what the director intended. However, it does make sense to me that even as impractical and scientifically illiterate as this proposal is, that the federal government would fund it. If you don't think that the federal government would spend a lot of money in a war situation on a weapon system that is impractical and ridiculous, you are clearly a person who has never heard of Project X-Ray. And if you have not heard of Project X-Ray, pause this, Google it. You'll thank me later.
It's a flashlamp pumped ultraviolet laser at 342 nanometers. Well, as you know, there is considerable interest in the atomic iodine laser for fusion. This is molecular iodine. Therefore, this laser doesn't suffer from the problem of recombination of the atomic iodine.
The way lasers work is that an atom is surrounded by electrons. Those electrons are in various levels. When energy is injected in the atom, the electron jumps up to a higher level. And then when it loses energy, it falls to the lower level, and that energy is released in the form of light. And that light is very specific to that energy transition, to what levels it's moving through. So I'm going to drop this baseball. So if you drop the baseball like this, it makes a certain sound. If you drop it at a higher level, it makes a louder sound. That's more energy from gravity dropping this down. The same thing is true in atoms. If you drop an electron from one level to another, the higher the drop, the difference in energy, the higher the energy photon that's going to be emitted, the more energy that is in that light. You might have, for some transitions, you might have radio light. For other transitions, you might have X-ray light. They span the gamut. Most of the time when you have an element, the electrons are mostly in that ground state, in that lowest energy state, so they need energy to be pumped into them. What he's doing is a flashlight pumped laser. The pumping system pumps energy into in this case, iodine, so that the electrons jump up to that higher level. And what you create is what is called an inversion, where instead of having what you have in normal gas, which is most of the energy at a low level and then a few of the electrons at that higher level, most of them are up at that high level. And so when you get that electrons falling and emitting light, what happens is it strikes another excited atom and it causes it to drop. And then you have now two photons of identical wavelength in phase so that the peaks and crests of the waves line up and increase the energy output. And that is called coherent light. That is what we call stimulated emission. And then what you have are mirrors on either end. So the light goes back and forth between them, creating more and more stimulated emission. And that also selects out light that is parallel, that's all in one line instead of going all higgly-piggly in each direction. Then you have a little hole in one end where the beam can come out. And that beam is going to have the properties of a laser. It's going to be coherent. In this case, that means that the peaks and troughs are lining up, so that intensifies the light. It's also a very narrow beam, both physically and in terms of wavelength, that you don't get this spread of colors. You get a very, very narrow color for that laser, and that improves the performance of the laser the narrower you can get it. What lasers mainly bring to the table is efficiency, that they allow an enormous amount of energy to be delivered to a target for a certain amount of input energy. A laser that doesn't have enough power to light this room could burn through metal. Just because of the way the waves line up, that you create this narrowness, you focus all the energy down into a very narrow beam of very narrow wavelength of coherent light, you can deliver enormous amounts of energy for the amount of energy you're putting into it. And so what he's talking about is using molecular iodine for this, a molecular laser. Usually use atomic lasers like argon and so forth. Carbon dioxide lasers were also very popular in the 1980s. So there are various elements that, because of their properties, are more conducive to producing this kind of laser light. Producing this as a high school student is pretty impressive and shows a very high degree of engineering aptitude by Mitch. He's now been admitted early at the age of 15 or whatever to Pacific Tech, Caltech. That does occasionally happen. I do know a few people in my field who went to college a couple of years early, as 17, 16, even as low as 14 or 13. Colleges will admit them if they think they can handle the work. And in this case, Dr. Hathaway needs someone on his laser project because he's under pressure to complete it in time to not get not only not fail the mission, but also get audited and maybe find out that he's been embezzling some of his research grants. But the basic idea, laser light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. The light from a flashlight is kind of random. And so if I shine it on my skin, it's not going to do anything. What a laser does is select out very specific wavelengths, puts them in phase, and puts them in a very narrow beam so that when it strikes my hand, it is imparting enormous amounts of energy. And if it were a powerful enough laser, it could burn the skin of my hand or burn through metal or whatever you need it to do. Now, notice Mitch also drops a line here about there's considerable interest in this kind of laser for nuclear fusion. This may have a familiar ring to it. Just last year, the National Ignition Facility achieved a huge breakthrough in nuclear fusion using lasers to implode pellets of hydrogen. And so that idea was current even in the 1980s.
Doc! It's reflexes. I'm Chris Knight.
Oh no.
Oh, yes. Doc again! Oh my God! It's heading for the gas tanks.
Doc.
Would you classify that as a launch problem or a design problem?
Design problem, absolutely.
Excuse me.
Yeah, Miss, what is it?
Well, I think the pump laser is down. This doesn't look right. Look.
Oh, it seems to be all better now.
Nowadays, of course, we think of lasers as being, just routine. We use lasers for everything. We use lasers for, I'm watching this on a laser device. We use lasers to work on people's eyes. My wife, a few years ago, had a torn retina, and they fixed it with shining a laser into her eye. We use lasers to etch materials. We use them to etch computer chips. We use them in everything. But in the mid-1980s, lasers were still relatively novel. And so this was very cutting-edge technology. So it's kind of hard to appreciate it now because this setup they have here is kind of, I had this set up in 1993 as an undergrad, and it was basically a standard lab we all did. And by now, I'm sure they're using lasers in high school or whatever. But in the 1980s, this setup that they're showing here was actually pretty advanced.
I'm Jordan. I forgot to tell you my name. I'm Jordan. I heard there was going to be someone new this term. Are you in?
Yes.
Oh, do you have a bed?
Yeah.
I was going to make you one if you didn't have one, but you have one. Okay, I'll see you later. Okay, bye.
Bye.
We're getting a few characters here, and probably one of my favorite characters in the movie, Jordan. My education background is I went to Carleton College in Minnesota. It's a small liberal arts college where I studied physics. And then I went to the University of Virginia to do my master's and PhD. I've been in these kind of academic environments for most of my life. When I was watching the 1980s, I was 13 years old. So I had, it was just kind of funny to me. Now I sort of look back on it and I do know, most people in the sciences are pretty normal, but you do get people who are personalities. It's kind of interesting to watch it from this perspective. I mean, she's kind of exaggerated version of people, but I do like the way the character is played. And I really think Michelle Meyerink does a really wonderful job with her. I need those slippers.
Chris,
Morning.
something strange happened to me this morning. Is that liquid nitrogen?
Mm-hmm. Coffee?
No.
That's clearly not liquid nitrogen that he's putting in there, since liquid nitrogen will melt pretty fast when it's exposed to air. I think he's using liquid nitrogen to freeze like carbon dioxide or something, but Yeah, that's not liquid nitrogen. Good joke, though.
That was yesterday. What have you done for me today?
Well,
I want 5 megawatts by mid-May.
5 megawatts for a laser would be extraordinarily powerful. And for that energy, you would probably need something in the ultraviolet or X-ray wavelength. But that was the kind of energy that they were talking about with being able to intercept missiles, and certainly to vaporize a target in a fraction of a second, like they show in the movie. You would need that kind of power. But it's way, way beyond anything that was achievable at the time or even now. Now, that's for a continuous beam. For a pulsed laser, where the laser is turning on and off, you can get instantaneous power that is way beyond that. The 192 beams of the National Ignition Facility are each 1,000 times more powerful than the laser they're talking about in this movie. And they're now talking about petawatt lasers that would be even 1,000 times more powerful than that.
Well, so what happened? Did he crack?
yes, Mitch, he cracked severely.
Why?
He loved his work.
Well, what's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that, but that's all he did. He loved solving problems. He loved coming up with the answers. But he thought that the answers were the answer for everything. All science, no philosophy. So then one day, someone tells him that the stuff that he was making was killing people.
In science, you have to have a little bit of a balance between life and work. And I do know people who go all the way on one side where they're just working all the time. And, you know, that's how they like to live, and more power to them. But it is a dangerous way. Sometimes when they're not working, they don't know what to do with themselves. Sometimes when they get to the end of their careers, they don't know what to do with themselves. They, basically work until they drop. And, that's how genius works. That's how Isaac Newton worked. But sometimes you have to have a little bit of a balance. And so I like this conversation they're having about, you have to have an idea of the bigger picture. Especially students in particular have a tendency to focus on the nuts and bolts of whatever project that they're working on and lose track of the bigger picture of what it is. Now, in astronomy, that's just, focusing on data reduction and losing track of the bigger scientific picture that you're trying to fit it into. But in something like engineering, that could be focusing on a particular engineering problem and not realizing how this fits into a larger scale program or a larger project and so forth. And so someone can find out, oh, hey, this thing I worked on was actually being used for weapons and so forth. Maybe one of the most famous examples of a brilliant scientist losing the plot was Thomas Midgley Jr., who not only added lead to gasoline, but came up with the idea of CFCs as air conditioning, and may have done more destruction to our atmosphere than any other organism in history. I do like this conversation that they have about you can't just be focused on the task in front of you. You have to have not only a vision of a bigger life, but a vision of how your work fits into the larger overall paradigm of what's going on, how your work fits into what is being done. Is your laser being used to create a weapon, or is it being used to fix people's eyes and so forth? So I really think this is a really interesting part of the movie that deals with these issues and deals with them in a funny and creative way. So this business of the practical joke they play on Kent, Caltech and MIT, and to some degree the University of Chicago, are kind of famous for these kind of practical jokes that students will play on the rival schools. Or I have been involved with practical jokes both as an undergraduate and a graduate student. I can't go into details, and I can neither confirm nor deny my involvement in things like the flaming shopping cart of death. And I do know of a specific incident where someone's car was disassembled and then reassembled in their room. This is not at all unrealistic about what someone might do at a place like Pacific Tech or how they would do it. So this is a very funny scene.
Finally, when it comes down to, if you can't do it, we'll have to get somebody else. I have a timetable, Doctor.
We're really very close, Dave. I'm sure there's absolutely nothing to worry about. Everything's going to be fine.
Don, try and remember, you work for me.
This business of having a timetable where they need to get the release developed by May, that's probably the most unrealistic part of the movie. There are very few federal projects, and especially not defense projects, that don't end up going over budget and past deadlines. So That's probably the most unrealistic part of the movie for me, that you have to get this done by May, rather than, oh, we're so close, just give us another $500 million in 3 years. So there are several things I like in that montage there. One of the things is it shows people studying. Chris apparently, get a bit of a case of senioritis until now, but everyone's really studying really hard. One of the things that people sometimes say to me is physics and stuff like that easy for you? And the answer is no, it's not. It never gets easy, but you do learn to work through it. The comparison I would make is when I was in graduate school, a group of us started lifting on the afternoons just to burn off some extra energy. And at first I was like a really weakling. I could barely lift the bar when I was bench pressing. And I would think, oh boy, I can't wait till they add those weights to it, and it really feels like a feather lifting that up. And what I discovered to my surprise was when they put the weights on there, it still felt really heavy. It's just I felt strong enough to move it. And it was a really powerful feeling. I was like, oh, okay, now I can see why people like lifting recreationally, because it is a really powerful feeling to feel all that weight and have the strength to move it. The same is similar with physics or math or anything else. It never really gets easy. You just develop the sort of mental muscles to be able to work through it. And it's a very empowering feeling to be able to do that. And I get to see it now from the other end on the occasions when I teach. I haven't taught in a couple of years and I miss it. But when I am explaining a complex concept to undergraduate students, and I usually try to teach a gen ed class, and you see that light bulb go off over their heads and they get it, it's a very rewarding thing where, they've worked through it, they've thought about it, they've been struggling with it, and suddenly, boop, oh, I get it now. But it never gets easy, and you always have to study. I was particularly problematic with this because when I was a kid, everything came easy to me. Then it really was easy. And then when I got into high school, things got hard and my grades crashed because I'd never developed the study habits or the work habits necessary to keep up with that stuff. It wasn't that I'd gotten dumb or wasn't smart enough. I just didn't have the habits. And so I built up my study habits, built up my work habits. And by the time I graduated, my grades were back up to A's and B's. And that was why I got into college, even though my overall GPA wasn't great. My GPA my last 2 years was really good. And then in college, the same thing happened. I started majoring in physics and my grades crashed again because, again, my study habits weren't good enough. And gradually over the course of college, they built up and I developed those better habits, better work habits, till by the time I graduated, I was getting A's and B's again. And then in grad school, same thing happened again. I was really struggling my first year, and then by the second year, and I was doing better. And probably the peak of my academic knowledge was when I took my qualifying exams my second year to qualify for the PhD program. I never really developed really good study habits like they do in this. But I do like that they show this. They, even for the smartest people on the face of the earth, this is hard. And I explain to my students when we talk about subjects like black holes and relativity and so forth, this stuff is hard even for really, really smart people, way, way smarter than me. If you're struggling with it, don't think that makes you stupid. It's a hard subject. And sometimes you just haven't built up the mental muscles, the experience, the background to be able to work through it. But eventually you can get there. I'm of the opinion that most people can get to a certain level of proficiency in math and science if they have good teachers. But for a lot of people, the problem is that they never really had good teachers, or at some point in their development had a poor teacher that sort of stunted their growth at some point. Now, the screaming part actually made me smile a little bit because when I was at Carleton, I don't know if they still do this, I hope they do, you would have exam weeks. You'd have a few days of studying and then a week of exams. And at the last night of the studying, before the exam started, they had what they called the primal scream, where people would stick their hat out their windows and just scream for stress relief. And you'd just be studying, and then you'd hear it start in one part of the campus, and people would stick their head out their windows and scream, and it'd be a nice stress relief, and then you go back to studying and so forth. So it does kind of remind me of that. But I can see when you're studying complex subjects, it can turn your brain into mush. There is more than one book in my library that I threw down at some point because I was like, I will never understand this. I'm so lost. My brain is tapioca. I have no idea what I'm doing. I can't do this. And so this is, even though this montage is a bit silly and is just sort of advancing the plot, 80s movies were really big on their montages. I do like this, that it shows the hard work and the stress that it can induce, even in some of the smartest people on Earth.
These are entries into the Frito-Lay Sweepstakes. No purchase necessary, enter as often as you want, so I am. That's great. How many times? Well, this batch makes it 1,650,000. I should win 32.6% of the prizes, including the car.
So this is actually based on a real thing. I don't know if anyone actually did this. I'll look it up and put notes in after the video. But someone did actually figure out, with these no cost for entry in as many times as you like, that even with the cost of postage, the number of prizes they were guaranteed made it worth it. There was a really famous one with frequent flyer miles and pudding or something like that. Again, I'll put a link in the description to that particular one. That, in the age of the internet, has fallen away because it's very easy to enter as many times as you like with no cost with a computer. So that has sort of fallen away. So this joke is kind of not aged as well as the others, but still kind of funny.
It is possible to synthesize excited bromide in an argon matrix. Yes, it's an exomer, frozen in its excited state. That's impossible. It's a chemical laser, but in solid, not gaseous form. Put simply, in deference to you, Kent, it's like lasing a stick of dynamite.
All right, so this is stretching my laser knowledge to its limits, but I do vaguely understand what he's getting at here. They actually did base this on some real contemporary science, and I looked up the papers and my brains melted, and then I thought sort of understand this. What he's talking about is an exomer, which is a molecular laser where you have two substances in there instead of one. You have, so you can have an argon laser, you can have a fluorine laser, but if you put argon and fluorine in, you can get a molecular reaction that then gets to a higher excited state and can get you into higher energies, like in the ultraviolet and so forth. So what he's talking about is combining argon and bromine to create a much more powerful laser than either of those elements would create except by itself. That you have, exomer means excited dimer, which means that you have two elements in there. And if any of you are laser experts and want to correct me in the comments, please do so. What he's talking about is there was a theory at the time that you could make solid lasers. That usually a laser, you have a gas in there, carbon dioxide, argon, something like that, and the light is moving back and forth and getting that stimulated emission and that coherent light emerging out one end. There was an idea that you could have solid lasers that are therefore you have a much more dense material, and therefore you're going to get way more amplification. If you have these excited atoms in the argon and the light's moving through it and causing them to fall and get that stimulated emission, the more atoms you have, the more energy you're going to emit. The closer you pack those atoms, the faster the energy is going to build up. We do have solid state lasers now that are sort of the cutting edge of laser science, but they are very different from what's portrayed in the movie. What you're usually talking about is a matrix material that is then doped with another material, and that produces the solid state laser. Hey, this is Editing Mike, and I hate to interrupt my own video, but I realized while I was editing that there was one thing I left out that's kind of important.
I figure we can extract at least 10 to the 21st photons per cubic centimeter, which will give 1 kilojoule per cubic centimeter at 600 nanometers, or 1 megajoule per liter.
That's hotter than the sun.
So, assuming that his statement of how many photons they're getting out of the laser is correct, his calculation of how much energy they're going to get at 600 nanometers is correct. It's a very simple formula that will convert number of photons to energy at a certain wavelength. And so he does that correct. However, there's a flaw. He says that these lasers operating at 600 nanometers, and you remember I said earlier, lasers operate in a very narrow wavelength range. 600 nanometers would produce an orangish red light. The laser they show in the movie is a purple laser that would be at much shorter wavelengths, more like 400 nanometers or something like that. And in reality, it would probably be somewhere in the ultraviolet, but that would produce a laser that you couldn't see, and that would not be very cinematic. So I do understand why they show that. But that is one little flaw in this scene.
I get your laundry? What is he doing? Look. I mounted the optics. The phase conjugate target tracking system. Now look at this mirror. Look! Look!
The mirror is actually a critical part of any laser. Mirrors don't reflect 100% of the light. the more efficient you can make your mirror, the better your laser is going to perform, because you're going to need to direct it some way. And the crossbow that they show at the beginning, the weapon system does have a mirror that reflects it down. Ultraviolet mirrors in particular, the bluer your wavelength, the higher energy light, the more powerful your laser is going to be. This is a purple laser, so that's showing a representative more powerful light. But if you had something as powerful, it'd probably be X-ray or ultraviolet light. You can't reflect X-rays. We usually have to use grazing incidents in that. Ultraviolet you can reflect, but mirrors you need very specific special mirrors to be able to reflect ultraviolet light so it doesn't just blast through the mirror. He's actually making a good point that he's done a lot of work for Hathaway with devising a mirror that can have very high reflectance of a very powerful laser.
Maybe somebody already has a use for it, one for which it is specifically designed.
You mean Dr. Hathaway had something in mind all along?
Look at the facts. Very high power, portable, limited firing time, unlimited range. All you need is a tracking system and a large spinning mirror, and you can vaporize a human target from space. This is not good.
This is a part of the movie that hits a little bit of a nerve here. One of the jokes we used to tell in graduate school was that if you didn't get a job in academia, your salary would double overnight. For people who with astronomy PhDs and really PhDs in a lot of physical sciences, there's enormous demand for people like that. Astronomers have a very low rate of unemployment. And defense industry in particular is hungry for engineers, for astronomers, for all kinds of people with STEM degrees. I do know personally a number of people who got their PhDs and went right into the defense industry. That's fine. I don't object to people working in the defense industry, but I do have an objection to someone unknowingly working for the defense industry. And in this case, being taken advantage of, as they say in the opening song of the movie, taking advantage of him and deceiving a student this way. And so this is, I think, a really interesting part of the movie, that if Kent clearly knew what they were doing, but Chris did not, and it was kept from him, probably because he's, probably has more pacifistic tendencies or would object to working in the defense industry. So this is one of the things I think is very villainous about Dr. Hathaway, that not that he necessarily designed this weapon system. People design weapons, that has to happen. And we just had a huge movie this summer about one of the most important weapon systems programs in history. But that you would do this without letting the people who are working for you know what they've gotten themselves into. All right, so this business of knocking Kent out. There are gases that knock people out for very short periods of time. If you've ever been under general anesthesia or something like that, there are different chemicals they use to knock people out or to keep people unconscious, or in extreme cases to execute people. One of those is a agent that will knock people out for a very short period of time. One of the things that we had as a rule when we played practical jokes when I was in college and when I was in graduate school was no permanent damage, NPD. That if the joke goes wrong, no one should be hurt. You should just be embarrassed, or it should, be kind of frustrating, but no one gets hurt. And with something like this, you run a real danger of getting someone hurt. We pay anesthesiologists enormous amounts of money because knocking people unconscious without killing them is an art form, and it's difficult to do. And you may remember many years ago, there was an incident where I think it was Chechen terrorists had seized a theater in Moscow, and they pumped in gas to try to knock him out and ended up killing a whole bunch of the hostages. That's why you wouldn't do something like this, because the danger of accidentally killing someone, I think, is real. It's a movie. They're being silly, but I just wanted to throw that out there. So I think the Mythbusters covered this adequately. You would probably be able to pop an enormous amount of popcorn this way, but you would not be able to destroy someone's house this way. Houses are built very strong, and popcorn is not exactly a force of nature. So it is an interesting way to end the movie, but not very realistic. So overall, in terms of scientific accuracy, Most of the talk about lasers is done accurately, and from what I understand, the laser that they eventually built is based on solid scientific theory that was good at the time, but is not valid now. The weapon system they describe is probably unrealistic, but as I said, it was deliberately unrealistic. What I like about this movie more is that it really feels like a college campus. This feels like what it's kind of like to be around smart people. That they can run the gamut from fairly normal to relatively goofy to, complete Sheldons. One of the reasons this movie works is that Martha Coolidge did her homework. She apparently went to places like Caltech and talked to students to find out what their lives were like. And that's why it has this feel of realism, that this is what actual college students would be like. Having watched it as a 13-year-old before I went into science and then watching it now is a little bit different experience. But even though, it's a Hollywood movie. Things are amplified. Things are made a little bit more silly, a little bit more exaggerated. Most of life around a bunch of scientists is pretty normal day to day, doing your work and partying when you can and so forth. So it's not as crazy as it's shown here. But the personalities, the way they interact, the way they talk, I think really has that feel to it of what it might be like to be at somewhere like Caltech and so forth. I, of course, did not go to Caltech, which is more scientifically oriented. I went to a liberal arts college. So I was not only around scientists, but more around musicians and writers and philosophers and pre-lawyers and all that sort of thing. So it was a little bit different. But I do really like the feel that this movie has for its characters and for the way they interact and the way they talk and the way they do things. And as far as 80s teen comedies go, which I guess this got sandwiched into that category, I think it's aged pretty well. There are some 80s teen comedy sort of things that have not aged well. I'm looking at you, Revenge of the Nerds. I think this is something I would not have any problem with my kids watching. And no one's going to mistake this movie for a classic, but it does have its charms. I think the cast is really a lot of fun. Val Kilmer was the only one who really went on to a big career. He did a lot of really good movies like The Doors and Top Gun, and had a really touching appearance in the Top Gun sequel. But at this time, he was more known for comedies. He'd been in Top Secret, and he was in this. What I really like about this movie, especially for someone like me, is it's eminently quotable. There are many lines in this movie that I routinely use, like this one.
Was it a dream where you see yourself standing in sort of sun god robes on a pyramid with 1,000 naked women screaming and throwing little pickles at you?
No.
Why am I the only person that has that dream?
Or this one.
You still run?
Only when chased.
This one I use on a regular basis.
Look, I want to start seeing a lot more of you in the lab.
Fine, I'll gain weight.
I've said this one from time to time.
If you think that by threatening me you can get me to be your slave, well, that's where you're right.
This one.
Why is that toy on your head?
Because if I wear it anywhere else, it cheats.
This one.
You are Chris Knight, aren't you?
I hope so. I'm wearing his underwear.
And the script is really clever and really funny. And if you have not seen this movie, again, it's not a classic. I'm not going to say that this is one of the best movies of the 1980s or the best movie in 1985 or anything like that. But it is a little bit of a gem. And I do know a lot of people who really like this movie. As I said, every time I mention this movie somewhere, people pop up and are like, oh, that movie's great. I really like it. So it's a really good experience. And again, I really just like the feel it has for its characters and the situation and what it's like to be around scientists and so forth. And that it keeps the technobabble to a minimum, but when it does it, keeps it within the ballpark of reasonable. And I think that is one of the reasons people buy into the movie and to the plot and so forth, as silly as it gets. So next time I'll be back with something more traditional, a sci-fi adventure or something like that. Or maybe we'll talk about some real science and so forth. Until then, I'm Mike Siegel. I write for Ordinary Times. Thank you for watching.